The lights were too bright that evening, not the kind of bright that makes a stage look glamorous, but the kind of glare that warns you something is about to shift, something no one can quite name until it is already happening. Inside the packed studio of Real Time with Bill Maher, the audience was laughing, murmuring, settling into the rhythm of another night of comedy and politics. They did not yet know that the story they would carry home, the clip they would forward across phones and family group chats, was not in the jokes. It was in the silence that fell when truth entered the room. Bill Maher leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, sipping casually from his mug. He had just returned from what he called a field trip for comedy, his visit to a Donald Trump rally in Bakersfield. Cameras had caught him clapping, laughing, blending into the sea of red hats. When pressed by critics, he insisted he was only observing. "It is comedy," he said. "You cannot fix the country without talking to everybody." But the firestorm online refused to die down. Was this bravery? Or was this betrayal? In that studio, under those relentless lights, Maher played it off. He cracked jokes about merch tables, about tribal madness. The audience chuckled politely. Yet one person did not laugh. Seated quietly on the far end of the panel, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas rested her pen against a cue card. She was calm, deliberate, her posture collected. She did not demand attention. She commanded it simply by being present. Crockett had faced confrontation before. She had sparred in courtrooms, stood against attacks in Congress, endured the noise of those who wished to drown her out. She knew when to wait, and she knew when to strike. When Maher turned toward her and said, "Congresswoman, I am sure you have thoughts," the temperature in the room changed. Crockett's voice was steady, Herr, gaze unwavering. She did not scold. She did not shout. She simply said, "This is not about merch tables or comedy. It is about what happens when people with platforms validate spaces that are openly hostile to others." The room, so ready to laugh, suddenly fell into stillness. A sentence, plain and unshaken, had landed sharper than any punchline. This is the hook of our story. A comedian tried to dismiss outrage as exaggeration. A congresswoman revealed why his laughter carried weight. In that moment, we saw not a clash of politics, but a lesson in responsibility. That silence in the face of harm is never neutral. It echoes. It spreads. It becomes permission for cruelty to thrive. And so we ask, what happens when truth walks calmly into a room built for distraction? What happens when a woman armed with only her voice and her conviction dismantles the pretense of neutrality? What happens when history, the history of those long silenced, of those dismissed as too sensitive, too dramatic, too much suddenly speaks through her and refuses to let the lights dim on injustice? Stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. It is the voice that was once interrupted, finally heard in full. Subscribe and journey with us for a black voice that will not be silenced. The story did not begin in that studio. To understand the power of what Jasmine Crockett said to Bill Maher, we must travel back into the foundations of America itself, where words, silence, and laughter have long been weapons. Every confrontation in the present carries echoes of past struggles, and the past for Black Americans is heavy with enforced silence, cruel humor, and spaces where truth was treated as trespass. Bill Maher has built his career on provocation. For decades, to his program Real Time has thrived on the uneasy marriage between comedy and politics. He presents himself as a jester who mocks the powerful, a skeptic who questions both left and right. For many viewers, he is the voice of irreverence, someone willing to say what others avoid. Yet built into that persona is an escape hatch, the claim that it is only comedy. That phrase has often shielded him from responsibility, as though laughter cannot wound, as though satire cannot validate, but history shows otherwise. Comedy has always been double-edged. It can liberate, or it can excuse. It can call out hypocrisy, or it can soften cruelty until it seems harmless. The Trump rally that Maher attended was not just a political gathering, it was part of a long American tradition where crowds define who belongs and who does not. Donald Trump's rallies have become infamous for chants that echo prejudice. Build the wall. Lock her up. Send her back. These phrases are not whispered in secret corners, they are shouted proudly in stadiums. For Ednice, They are entertainment. For those targeted, they are reminders of exclusion and threat. To walk into that space and clap along, even in jest, is to step into fire. For some, it appears daring. For others, it feels like betrayal. For Jasmine Crockett, it was worse than either. It was validation of hostility. American rallies have always been stages of conflict. In the 1950s, white citizens' councils gathered to resist desegregation, dressing bigotry as civic duty. In the 1960s, civil rights marches were met with counter-protests full of jeers, rocks, and spittle. The spectacle of the crowd has two faces. It can be the March for Freedom across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or it can be the mob screaming at black children entering school in Little Rock. The difference is not in size or volume. It lies in the spirit. It lies in whether the gathering protects dignity or threatens it. Into this history steps Jasmine Crockett. She did not arrive in Congress through privilege. She was born in St. Placid, Louis, Missouri, studied law, and built her name defending civil rights in courtrooms before stepping onto the national stage. She represents South Dallas, a district marked by hardship, but also resilience, where communities live daily with the realities of systemic neglect. Her voice in Congress carries not only her own convictions, but the burdens and hopes of those who trusted her to speak for them. When she talks about hate, she is not speaking in abstractions. She is speaking about phone calls she has received, letters filled with threats, and conversations with neighbors who fear being followed home. She embodies a truth too often ignored, that racism is not an argument in theory, but a wound in flesh. This is why her confrontation with Bill Maher mattered. He can dip into a rally, laugh, and return to his platform untouched. She cannot. Her people cannot. The fire she described is not a metaphor. It is lived reality. It is being shadowed in a grocery store, humiliated in front of a child, or silenced in a classroom. It is a note slipped into a locker telling a boy to go back. For Maher, these are stories he can dismiss as overreaction. For Crockett, they are her constituents' lives. She does not have the luxury of treating hate as spectacle. Older African Americans who watched that exchange recognized its pattern instantly. They remember comedians who joked about segregation as if it were harmless. They remember television hosts who dismissed civil rights leaders as too loud. They remember governors who insisted racism was exaggerated, even as violence broke out in their towns. They know the cost of minimization. They know the danger of silence. Crockett's words struck deeply because they identified the pattern. When those with influence laugh inside spaces of hate, they grant cover for cruelty. They make hostility look ordinary. The roots of this conflict go even deeper, into the paradox of American freedom. The Constitution spoke of liberty, while counting enslaved Africans as 3/5 of a person. Political debate has often disguised oppression in the language of order, and entertainment has too often softened that oppression, turning real suffering into material for jokes. Crockett's intervention exposed this contradiction. She reminded the audience that neutrality does not exist when hate is at stake. To be present without protest is to participate by omission. This context explains why the studio in Burbank grew so silent. Maher thought he was defending open dialogue, but what Crockett revealed was his failure to acknowledge the stakes. His platform gives weight to his choices. His presence in a Trump rally was not neutral observation. It was endorsement by proximity. The moment he laughed, the harm was disguised as humor. And when he called it a comedy field trip, the cruelty was softened into curiosity. Crockett named the danger. If you see fire and pretend it is warmth, others will get burned. The clash between Crockett and Maher was never simply a debate between a congresswoman and a comedian. It was a confrontation between two traditions. One tradition treats speech as entertainment, dismissing outrage as performance. The other tradition treats speech as survival, where silence or laughter can decide whether a community is safe. One tradition assumes it can enter any room and leave unchanged. The other knows that rooms change people, and people change laws, and laws change lives. Jasmine Crockett stood in that tradition of survival. Her words that night did not rise in anger. They were calm, deliberate, cutting through the performance of comedy to reach the truth. And that truth is the root of this story. Presence is never neutral. Silence is never empty. Laughter is never harmless. Every platform carries weight. And when the lights are bright and the crowd is laughing, the choice to tell the truth or to ignore it shapes more than a moment. It shapes the memory of a people who have been told for centuries to stay quiet, to take the joke, to endure the spectacle. Crockett's refusal to do so made history echo once again. Every great confrontation begins, not in its climax, but in its first hesitant steps. The exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Bill Maher in that Burbank studio could only take place because of the choices made in the days before choices wrapped in calculation, provocation, and no small measure of arrogance. Bill Maher believed he was stepping into a theater of politics to collect material for jokes. What he entered was a proving ground for the soul of American dialogue, and what Jasmine Crockett brought to that table was not simply rebuttal, but a lifetime of preparation. Bill Maher's decision to attend a Trump rally in Bakersfield was not spontaneous. He had teased it on his podcast, framing it as a comedian's duty to observe all tribes. "You cannot fix a country without talking to everyone," he said, as though standing in the crowd of red hats was the same as listening. His producers worried about optics, but Maher dismissed them. For him, it was an experiment. For others, it was an act of betrayal. Bakersfield, California, was not chosen by accident. It is a stronghold of Trump's support, a place where resentment against so-called coastal elites runs deep. For Maher, who had spent years mocking Trumpism from afar, walking into that arena was both dangerous and delicious. He laughed, clapped, bought a drink, and blended into the crowd. Cameras captured his grin. The footage spread before the rally even ended. The backlash arrived instantly. On social media, commentators split into camps. Some applauded Maher's willingness to step into hostile ground. Others condemned him for normalizing hate. Headlines declared, "Maher mingles with MAGA. Bill at the rally. Comedy or complicity?" The internet is never short of verdicts. But what made this story sharper was the sense that Maher was enjoying the storm. He doubled down in interviews, calling critics too sensitive. He insisted the visit was a comedy field trip. He brushed aside outrage as if it were part of the joke. But comedy, as history teaches, is never only laughter. It is always a mirror. The question was, whose reflection was Maher showing? Back in Dallas, Jasmine Crockett watched the discourse unfold. She was not shocked, not after years of seeing public figures treat her community's suffering as spectacle. But she was ready. As a freshman congresswoman, she had quickly established herself as someone unafraid of confrontation. In committee hearings, she had clashed with Republicans who dismissed racial justice. In her district, she had walked the streets with residents who faced intimidation for simply displaying campaign signs. She had built her political career on listening first, then speaking with precision. That rhythm, patience followed by clarity would become her weapon against Maher. When the panel lineup for real time was announced, observers noticed Crockett's name immediately. Some predicted fireworks. Others expected her to be overshadowed. She herself made no predictions. She arrived prepared, not with rehearsed soundbites, but with stories. Stories of her sister in Midland, followed through a supermarket. Stories of a 17-year-old student in Fort Worth who stopped raising his hand after being told to go back. Stories of constituents who lived under a cloud of suspicion because of the color of their skin. She carried these voices not as props but as truths. Where Maher would carry jokes, she would carry testimonies. The night of the taping, the atmosphere in the studio was restless. The audience was eager to laugh, but also curious. They had read the headlines. They knew the host was under fire. Maher leaned into the controversy. "This week's outrage is apparently me." Equipped, crossing his legs, smiling to the crowd. He described the rally with his usual irony, painting pictures of merch tables and tribal madness. The audience chuckled politely. But polite laughter has a fragile edge. It wavers when truth approaches. Crockett sat silently through Maher's opening. She did not roll her eyes or interrupt. She waited. Her presence itself was a quiet disruption, a reminder that this was not only comedy, but politics lived in flesh. When Maher finally turned to her, inviting her thoughts, she adjusted her microphone and spoke calmly. "This is not about merch tables or comedy," she began. "It is about what happens when people with platforms validate spaces that are openly hostile to others." The room shifted. Laughter thinned. Eyes turned. This was the beginning of her dismantling, not an explosion. But a scalpel? Maher raised his eyebrows, joked about harshness, tried to keep the tone light. But Crockett's words had set the terms. She was not debating comedy. She was naming responsibility. And once responsibility is named, it cannot be laughed away. For older viewers, especially African Americans who have seen generations of minimization, this first step was crucial. Too often, debates dissolve into shouting matches, each side raising volume until meaning disappears. Crockett chose another path. She did not outshout Maher. She outweighted him. She let him talk, expose his logic, reveal his dismissal. Then she answered, with stories that could not be brushed aside. The power of her beginning lay in its calm. Calm is not silence. Calm is preparation. Calm is the storm's opposite, the pause that makes the thunder inevitable. The journey into confrontation had started. Maher still believed he could charm his way out. That irony would be his shield. But Crockett had already shifted the ground beneath him. She had moved the discussion from entertainment to accountability, from observation to consequence. And once that shift occurred, the old escape hatch, it is, only comedy began to close. The opening steps of any struggle decide its course. Crockett's opening was deliberate, patient, grounded in lived truth. By choosing calm over noise, she ensured that when the storm came, it would be his storm, not hers. That was the genius of her beginning, the root of her journey on that stage. And it was only the start. The studio had grown tense. The early chuckles had faded into silence, the kind of silence that is louder than any laugh. Bill Maher leaned back in his chair, still trying to maintain control of the stage. But Jasmine Crockett had already shifted the air. The conversation was no longer about whether comedy could be neutral. It was about whether silence in the face of cruelty could ever be defended. This was the battlefield, and every word now carried the weight of history. Maher tried to reclaim the rhythm. He spoke with his usual smirk, insisting that critics were overreacting. I was only observing, he said. I have always gone where the fire is. Then I come back and tell the story. To his audience, it sounded like a justification. To Crockett, it sounded like evasion. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but pointed. And who gets burned in that fire? The question landed with a force no joke could match. Maher blinked, taken aback. The audience murmured. For the first time all night, he seemed unsure of his footing. Crockett did not rush. She let the pause do its work, then added, I represent people in South Dallas who have been threatened just for putting a sign in their yard. I have constituents who have been followed home, screamed at, told to leave shops, simply because of how they look or what they believe. That energy does not come from nowhere. It is fed. It is allowed. And when people with platforms visit those spaces and call it a field trip, it tells the rest of the world those fears are exaggerated. Her words were not loud. They were steady, direct, undeniable. The audience leaned in, caught between discomfort and revelation. Maher tried again. So now I am responsible for what random strangers shout at rallies. That is unfair. I did not say those things. He chuckled, hoping the room would follow. But laughter did not return. Crockett answered, her tone unshaken. I am not saying you shouted them. I am saying you laughed while they were shouted. You called it a comedy experiment, but you did not leave that rally telling the truth of what was said. You softened it. You made it sound less dangerous than it is. That matters. Bill, it matters because people watch you. And when you say it was not that bad, they believe you. The strategist on the panel shifted in his chair. The tech entrepreneur tapped his pen nervously, then stopped. Even the author, who had filled earlier segments with self-quotations, had gone silent. The clash had narrowed to two figures, the comedian with the platform and the Congresswoman with the weight of lived truth. It was no longer a discussion. It was a reckoning. Then came the story that froze the room. Crockett spoke of a boy in Fort Worth, 17 years old, honor student, dreaming of environmental law. One day he challenged something his teacher said about immigration. The next morning he found a note in his locker. It said only 2 words. Go back. The teacher had never spoken racist words aloud. Crockett explained, but he had created a space where a student felt safe enough to deliver that note. And the boy, her constituent, did not even bother to report it. What is the point? He told her. They will just say I misunderstood. The story landed heavier than any argument. It was not theory. It was testimony. It was what happens when silence is mistaken for neutrality. Maher swallowed, visibly uncomfortable, yet he tried once more to redirect. Do you not think some of this comes from people being too sensitive? Sometimes words are just words. Cannot we learn to tune them out? Crockett raised her eyebrow, her expression calm but piercing. You want teenagers to just tune out when they are told to leave the country? Maher had no reply. The audience held its breath. Crockett leaned in, her voice steady. What if that was your nephew? Your goddaughter? What if someone said that to them? Would you call it sensitivity then? The strategist exhaled audibly. The author set her water glass down. The audience shifted in their seats. No one dared laugh. The battle was clear. Maher defended himself as a comic, claiming immunity through irony. Crockett held him accountable as a citizen, as a man with influence. You do not get to escape the impact just because you call it comedy, she told him. We all make choices about where we stand, who we stand with, and what we say afterward. Those choices matter. Her words were not a roar. They were a verdict, and they left no space for laughter. The climax of the exchange came when she delivered her sharpest truth yet. You know what the most dangerous part of all this is? She asked, pausing just long enough for the room to still further. It is not even the hate. It is the people who do not see it as hate. The ones who shrug it off. The ones who go to rallies, hear what is said, and walk away, thinking it was just loud music and funny signs. You are smart, Bill. You know better. That is why this matters. The sentence cut like a blade. For the first time in his own studio, Maher looked like a man who had lost his stage. The room remained hushed. A woman in the third row nodded slowly. A man at the back leaned forward on his knees. The stage crew, usually restless, stood still. Even those who disagreed felt the gravity of the moment. And in the silence, Crockett's words hung like a judgment. The strategist finally spoke, almost under his breath. This is not about politics anymore. It is about responsibility. The author whispered, I had not thought of it that way. The panel, once a jumble of voices, had become an echo chamber for Crockett's clarity. Then she dropped the line that would ricochet across the internet. You do not have to march with extremists to be useful to them. It was not shouted. It was spoken quietly, almost gently, but the weight was undeniable. The audience gasped. Maher lowered his eyes. The battle was over. Even if the program still had time to fill, the comedian had been disarmed. Not by volume, but by truth spoken plainly. The social battle, however, was only beginning. Clips of the exchange would spread within minutes. Commentators would argue, supporters would cheer, critics would sneer, but none could erase the memory of the silence in that studio, the silence that replaced laughter, the silence that proved Crockett had won, not by shouting, but by holding her ground with calm precision. And so Chapter 3 closed not with applause, but with recognition. Recognition that accountability is not entertainment, that silence has consequences, and that a black congresswoman had stood on a stage designed for jokes and turned it into a courtroom for truth. The silence inside the studio had already grown heavy, but what came next turned that weight into something almost unbearable. Bill Maher, sensing his grip slipping, leaned forward with his hands clasped, as though he could summon authority through posture alone. His voice dropped lower, slower, more deliberate. Jasmine, he began, you make some good points. You really do. But do you not think sometimes the outrage gets a little performative? Not everything is a 5-alarm fire. He forced a half smile, waiting for the audience to chuckle. They did not. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. His attempt to regain control had backfired. He had just stepped deeper into the fire. Jasmine Crockett did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch. Every second, a quiet rebuke. Then, with her voice sharpened but steady, she spoke not to Maher, not even to the panel, but to the people watching in that room and beyond the cameras. You want to talk about performance? Let me tell you what performance feels like in real life. It is pushing your baby through a grocery store while someone follows you, whispering, if you are on benefits. That happened to my sister in Midland. Broad daylight. No cameras. No viral clip. Just humiliation. Then a trip home with milk and bread. Her voice did not tremble. It cut cleanly. Every word. A blade. The audience gasped softly. The sound of recognition, rather than surprise. Maher's smirk vanished. He opened his mouth to reply, then closed it again. He knew instinctively that to joke here would be suicide. Crockett pressed on. This is not about 5-alarm fires. This is about the slow burn people live with every day. And when someone with your platform plays tourist in that environment, then walks away without naming it for what it is, you are not neutral. You are quiet at the worst possible time. The studio went still, even the control booth upstairs. Usually, a hive of murmurs seemed to freeze. Everyone could sense the confrontation had left the realm of debate. It had entered judgment. Maher tried once more, reaching for the persona that had saved him in past controversies. I am a comedian, he insisted. I expose hypocrisy. I tell jokes. That is what I do. But Crockett leaned forward, unblinking. And you do, sometimes. But hypocrisy does not only exist in the left's safe spaces. It exists in the red hat chants, in the dog whistles, in the way you can laugh at chaos from the sidelines and still get praised as brave for showing up. The question is, who does that bravery serve? The line cut deeper than any accusation. The audience held its breath. Even Maher looked stricken, as though seeing his own reflection for the first time. The tension had reached its peak. This was no longer about a rally. It was about the ethics of platforming, the responsibility of speech, the cost of silence. Maher, disperate, asked the question that betrayed his fear. So what am I supposed to do? Never leave my bubble. Only talk to people who agree with me. That is how we got here in the first place. His voice, usually laced with sarcasm, cracked faintly at the edges. Crockett's reply was calm, almost gentle. No one is saying do not go. Go wherever you want. But do not pretend your presence is neutral. Do not act like your silence in the room does not echo when you walk out of it. Her words struck like a verdict. The strategist on the panel nodded slowly, as if conceding a truth he had long avoided. The author put her glass down carefully, unwilling to make noise that might break the moment. The tech entrepreneur stared at the table, pen forgotten. Maher sat upright, the weight of the exchange pressing visibly upon him. He was no longer the host commanding laughter. He was a man held accountable in his own house. And then came the line that would haunt him. Crockett turned slightly toward the audience. Here, gaze steady, her tone unwavering. Some of you are so used to being centered that the moment someone asks you to see from the margins, it feels like an attack. The words rippled across the room. A few gasps. A low hum of recognition. No applause. Just stillness. Stillness thicker than any laugh track. Maher glanced toward his producers. Not out of panic, but like a man stalling for time. But there was no escape hatch left. The truth had been spoken. The crisis deepened. The audience was no longer watching entertainment. They were watching accountability unfold live. Crockett leaned back slightly, composed, as if reminding everyone that calm could be more devastating than anger. We are not asking for pity, she continued. We are asking for honesty. When you choose where to stand, to be honest about what is behind you. Because somebody is always watching, her words rang with the clarity of a sermon. In that instant, the debate had transformed into testimony, the studio into a courtroom, the audience into witnesses. For Maher, the moment was catastrophic. His strategy, irony, deflection, dismissal had failed. Instead of laughter, there was silence. Instead of agreement, there was reflection. And in that silence, his authority crumbled. He tried to joke, to shift, to salvage. But the air had changed. He was no longer in charge of the room. Crockett was. Not by force, not by volume, but by the precision of truth. And once truth takes the stage, no amount of laughter can remove it. The crisis of the evening was not just Maher's discomfort. It was the audience's awakening. They came expecting comedy. But they left having witnessed history. They saw a black congresswoman hold a white comedian accountable. Not through outrage, but through unflinching honesty. They saw what happens when silence is named as complicity. And they felt, deep in their bones, that the line between entertainment and accountability had been crossed forever. That was the high point, the breaking point, the crisis. And as the cameras rolled, The audience knew they would never forget what they had just seen. The room had gone still, but the world outside was about to get loud. When the credits rolled that night, the audience inside the studio left quietly, almost reverently, as if they had witnessed something too fragile to spoil with noise. But beyond the studio walls, silence could not hold. Within minutes, the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Bill Maher leapt from shaky audience phone recordings to the boundless currents of the internet. The battle that had unfolded under bright lights in Burbank was now being replayed, re-edited, and reinterpreted in living rooms, classrooms, and city buses across America. The first clip to go viral was less than a minute long. It showed Crockett leaning forward, calm but resolute, delivering the line, "You do not have to march with extremists to be useful to them." That sentence struck like a verdict, too sharp to be softened, too clear to be ignored. On social media platforms, captions bloomed. Jasmine Crockett dismantles Maher on his own show. Calm, precise, real. She said it for me. The video spread with the speed of wildfire, crossing platforms, continents, and political camps. For those who had long sought a voice that spoke their truth, this was vindication. For others, it was a challenge they could not easily dismiss. By dawn the next morning, news outlets had seized upon the story. Headlines framed it as a clash of generations, a duel between comedy and accountability, a viral moment that demanded analysis. Talk radio buzzed with callers. Some praised Crockett for bringing dignity to a noisy world. Others defended Maher, claiming he had been unfairly ambushed. But regardless of perspective, one fact was undeniable. People were talking, not about punchlines, but about responsibility. A late-night talk show had transformed into a public tribunal. Teachers quickly recognized the power of the clip as a teaching tool. In a classroom in Missouri, a civics teacher played the video for her students and asked, "What does it mean to speak without shouting?" A boy in the back replied, "It means people cannot say you were emotional, only honest." The lesson was clear. Calm could carry more weight than fury. Across the country, educators used Crockett's words to spark conversations about civic courage, the cost of silence, and the responsibility of platforms. What had begun as a heated exchange was now reshaping young minds. The ripple reached further still. In Austin, a small business owner recorded herself watching the clip, tears in her eyes. "I have followed Maher for years," she admitted, "but last night was the first time I felt like someone on his show was speaking for people like me." In Chicago, a retired minister replayed the video during a church discussion on justice, framing it as a modern parable. The prophet confronting the entertainer. Truth-piercing performance. In Accra, Ghana, a journalist wrote an op-ed linking Crockett's calm dismantling to Africa's long history of leaders who spoke truth to power without raising their voices. The resonance was global. Bill Maher, too, could not ignore the aftermath. On his podcast the following Monday, his tone was different. Not apologetics, not defeated, but measured. "Congresswoman Crockett gave me a lot to think about," he said. "I do not agree with everything she said, but I heard her, and I understand why it landed the way it did. That conversation was not comfortable, but maybe that is the point." For Maher, this was a concession, however small. The jester who once laughed off outrage had been forced to admit that some laughter was costly. His audience noticed. Some applauded his openness. Others accused him of capitulation. But either way, he had shifted. Crockett, by contrast, did not indulge in victory laps. She reposted a few clips, thanked supporters, then returned to her work in Congress. In an interview later that week, when asked whether she would appear on Maher's show again, she smiled lightly. "If the invitation is there, perhaps. But my goal is not to win arguments on television. My job is to make sure people who never get the microphone still get heard." That plain, unpolished response only deepened her resonance. She had not come to perform. She had come to testify. The political class, however, could not resist turning the moment into ammunition. Allies of Crockett hailed her as a rising star, proof that new black voices in Congress were reshaping the national conversation. Critics dismissed her as overly dramatic, claiming she had politicized comedy. Yet beneath the noise, something more enduring had happened. People had been reminded that truth does not need volume to carry weight. Crockett had proven that stillness could be more devastating than spectacle. In communities across America, the impact was tangible. In Dallas, constituents of Crockett spoke with pride. "She took our stories to a stage we never thought would hear them," one woman said. In New York, activists preparing for a rally played the clip through loudspeakers before marching, using her words as a rallying cry. Online, hashtags emerged. "She said it for me." "Truth in the room." Crockett calm. Strangers across the country found themselves repeating the line that had stopped Maher cold. Silence at the worst time is not neutrality. It is complicity. It became more than a quote. It became a creed. The impact was not without backlash. Conservative commentators mocked the applause Crockett received as evidence of political correctness. Others accused her of exploiting personal anecdotes for sympathy. Yet each attack only spread the clip further. The more detractors tried to diminish her, the more people sought out her original words to hear for themselves, and each time they found not anger, but clarity, not shouting, but steady insistence. Even critics admitted privately that she had shifted the frame. The argument was no longer whether Maher had the right to attend a rally. The argument was whether presence itself could ever be innocent. This was the true aftermath. A conversation widened, deepened, and reframed. Crockett had taken a late-night segment and transformed it into a national reckoning. The consequences were not measured in ratings or applause, but in recognition that words have weight, recognition that silence is never empty, recognition that a single calm voice can alter the way a nation sees itself. For some, it was a revelation. For others, an irritation. But for all, it was unforgettable. The night in Burbank had ended in stillness. The days that followed erupted in dialogue. This was the paradox of Crockett's intervention. She won not by igniting noise, but by creating silence so profound that it demanded response. That silence became sound. That sound became echo. And that echo carried far beyond the studio, reshaping classrooms, pulpits, workplaces, and homes. The consequence of her words was not only Maher's discomfort, it was a nation reminded that truth, spoken calmly, can roar louder than any joke. Long after the applause faded and the studio lights dimmed, the echoes of that night refused to vanish. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Bill Maher had escaped the boundaries of a television program. It had become a parable retold in homes, classrooms, and churches. People no longer referred to it as just another real-time episode. They called it "The Night Silence Was Put on Trial." Its weight proved that some exchanges outlive entertainment. They become markers in cultural memory. For Crockett, the aftermath was not a victory lap. She did not tour the media, basking in applause. Instead, she kept working, meeting constituents, pressing bills, listening to people in Dallas who had fueled her words. When asked if she felt she had won, she dismissed the question. This is not about winning. It is about making sure voices usually ignored cannot be erased. Her calm refusal to frame the moment as competition reinforced her authenticity. She was not chasing headlines. She was carrying testimony. Commentators quickly dissected the exchange. Scholars of rhetoric praised the way Crockett dismantled sarcasm with steadiness, proving that calm could be more devastating than rage. Political analysts noted how she shifted the debate from personality to responsibility, from comedy to consequence. In lecture halls, professors replayed the clip alongside speeches from civil rights leaders, highlighting how composure could disarm arrogance. It became a case study in modern accountability, a reminder that clarity can wound more sharply than volume. Beyond academia, the influence spread into communities. Pastors quoted Crockett in Sunday sermons, describing her courage as an echo of prophets who confronted kings with truth instead of weapons. Activists replayed her clip in training sessions, reminding one another that accountability is not always loud. Elders in Black communities compared her to leaders of earlier generations who had stood before hostility and chosen dignity over fury. The moment was woven into a much older tradition, the practice of truth-telling against power. Maher's audience also shifted. Some longtime viewers admitted that Crockett's words had forced them to reconsider casual dismissals of harm. Others reacted defensively, but even they could not shake her line. Silence at the worst time is not neutrality. That sentence lingered in headlines, in graffiti, on protest signs. It became a shorthand for accountability, a reminder that passivity could equal complicity. Maher himself seemed altered. On later shows, his tone was sharper but less careless, as though he recognized that jokes alone could not shield him. The staying power of the moment lay not only in Crockett's poise, but in her principle. She proved that stillness could carry as much weight as spectacle. Her calm did not dilute her message, it crystallized it. That lesson rippled outward. Teachers encouraged students to see that one can be firm without shouting, fearless without hostility. Organizers replayed the clip before marches, showing that a steady voice could unsettle power more effectively than noise. Her example did not invite imitation of style. It invited emulation of courage. For many African American elders, the resonance was profound. They wrote letters, thanking her for showing their grandchildren how to confront power without rage. One grandmother told her, "I watched with my grandson. For the first time, he saw that dignity can be louder than anger." That generational transmission mattered. It turned a televised debate into a family lesson, a living bridge between past and present struggles. Internationally, Crockett's words found fertile ground. In Ghana and Kenya, journalists compared her calm rebuke to the voices of anti-colonial leaders who had refused to trivialize harm. In London, a columnist wrote that she had reminded the West that silence is never innocent. In Canada, educators used the clip in workshops on subtle discrimination. What had started in Burbank now traveled across continents, proving that accountability was a universal language. Months later, when the news cycle had moved on, the clip persisted. It lived not as breaking news but as testimony. Families replayed it at dinner tables. Churches incorporated it into discussions of justice. Protesters replayed it through loudspeakers before chanting, "The endurance of the moment was proof that it had tapped something deeper than politics. It had touched the moral imagination." Critics, of course, tried to belittle it. They called it overhyped, just another viral spat. But their dismissals only revealed the opposite. If the moment had truly been trivial, it would have faded. Its persistence was its proof. People did not forget because it was not forgettable. Crockett had spoken a truth too plain to erase. Her own profile rose, but she did not let celebrity eclipse service. She reminded interviewers that her central duty remained in Dallas, among people whose stories she had carried into the studio. This return to the basics reinforced her credibility. She had not spoken for applause. She had spoken because truth demanded it. Perhaps the greatest legacy of that night was how it reframed debates. No longer could public figures defend inaction by claiming neutrality. Crockett had stripped that mask away. She shifted the question from whether one could enter hostile spaces to how one bore the weight of being there. That reframing altered conversations in media and politics. Neutrality was no longer safe ground. It was exposed as complicity. Years from now, when people recall this era of division, they may forget the punchlines, but they will remember the look on Maher's face as silence was put on trial. They will remember Crockett's calm voice, steady as steel, refusing to let harm be minimized. And they will remember that sometimes the most lasting revolutions begin not with thunder, but with quiet words that cut through the noise. In the end, the long-term influence of that night was not about two individuals locked in debate. It was about the truth revealed that words carry weight, silence has consequence, and accountability is not optional. Once spoken, that truth could not be unsaid. It became a standard. It transformed a late-night studio into a historical stage, a place where entertainment gave way to testimony. And in that transformation, the world was reminded that dignity, spoken calmly, can echo longer than laughter. When the story of that night is retold in years to come, it will not be remembered as a clash between a comedian and a congresswoman. It will be remembered as a moment when the boundaries of entertainment cracked open to reveal something heavier, something unignorable. For in that brightly lit studio, amidst laughter and casual banter, Jasmine Crockett showed that truth can cut through even the thickest layers of irony. She demonstrated that silence, often dressed as neutrality, can be more dangerous than open hostility. The beauty of that confrontation was not in its drama, but in its restraint. Crockett did not raise her voice. nor did she attempt to score rhetorical points. She spoke with steadiness, the kind that comes from carrying the weight of other people's stories. Every example she gave, a student silenced by fear, a sister humiliated in a grocery aisle, a constituent followed home, was not theory, but testimony. By bringing those voices into the room, she shifted the center of gravity. What had begun as a debate about comedy ended as a reckoning about responsibility. For Maher, it was a sobering reminder that not all outrage can be laughed away. His career has long been built on poking sacred cows, mocking hypocrisy, and finding humor in contradiction. But that night, he discovered that some contradictions are too costly to reduce to punchlines. The studio audience, accustomed to chuckling along, instead found themselves leaning forward, listening with the intensity reserved for courtroom verdicts or church sermons. In that silence, something rare happened. Accountability, uninvited yet unavoidable, entered the room. The lasting lesson of that night is that presence matters. To stand in a space is to lend it legitimacy, whether one intends to or not. Crockett's calm insistence on this point pierced through the noise of political spin. "If you go, own the weight of it," she said. That line resonates because it is universal. It speaks to politicians attending rallies, to celebrities lending their platforms, to ordinary citizens choosing where they stand. Our choices of presence are never neutral. They either protect or endanger. Affirme or rule. To pretend otherwise is to deny the power of witness. The wider world recognized the weight of her words. Teachers used them to spark dialogue about courage. Pastors folded them into sermons about justice. Activists replayed them as reminders that dignity can be more radical than noise. Across oceans, commentators drew connections to struggles against colonialism, apartheid, and dictatorship, where silence had always been the accomplice of oppression. Crockett's reminder was simple but piercing. Silence echoes, and what it echoes can either save lives or endanger them. For African American elders, the resonance was deeply personal. They saw in Crockett's steadiness the continuation of a long tradition, from the spirituals sung in hushed defiance, to the speeches delivered on courthouse steps, to the testimonies whispered in church basements. She had tapped into that lineage, showing the younger generation that power is not only in shouting but also in refusing to let harm be normalized. In her calm, they recognized resilience. In her clarity, they recognized survival. In her refusal to laugh along, they recognized dignity. The confrontation also offered a model for political discourse in a fractured age. In a time when shouting matches dominate airwaves and anger is mistaken for authenticity, Crockett showed another path. Speak plainly, listen carefully, and never mistake silence for safety. This model does not eliminate conflict, but it transforms it. Instead of noise that evaporates, it creates echoes that endure. Instead of heat that burns quickly, it produces light that guides steadily. Her method is not merely rhetorical, it is generational wisdom applied to modern crises. As the credits rolled that night, the audience did not erupt in applause. They sat in stillness, processing. That reaction was telling. Applause is easy. Forgettable. Stillness is harder. Stillness means something has pierced the skin of routine, forcing reflection. That stillness traveled out of the studio into homes, schools, churches, and parliaments. It turned a television program into a national conversation, a viral clip into a moral mirror, and once that mirror was held up, it could not be unseen. The conclusion of this story is not victory or defeat, but reminder. A reminder that laughter is not always innocent, that silence is not always neutral, and that presence is never without consequence. Crockett did not seek to silence Maher. She sought to make him, and all who watched, hear the silences they had been ignoring. In doing so, she reminded the nation of something essential, that truth, spoken with calm conviction, carries farther than any joke, any shout, any viral applause. Years from now, when people look back, they may not remember the exact date or even the specific program, but they will remember the Congresswoman who sat calmly on a stage built for comedy and turned it into a stage for conscience. They will remember the way her words hung in the air like a verdict no one could appeal. They will remember the hush that followed, heavier than applause, And they will remember that sometimes the loudest mic drop is not a roar, but a whisper that refuses to be ignored. In that sense, the conclusion is not an ending, but an invitation. An invitation to carry forward what was revealed, that silence has weight, that neutrality is a myth, and that accountability is the measure of presence. Crockett accepted that responsibility. The question left behind is whether the rest of us will do the same.